They don't just have being overweight. They'll be pre-diabetic, where their blood glucose will be slightly elevated. They'll have mildly elevated blood pressure. They'll have increased fats, not just in their tissues, what we call adipose tissue, but also in their blood and their liver and other sites. They'll have some evidence of systemic inflammation. And another particularly interesting finding is that many of them will have a high uric acid in their blood. And uric acid is present in everybody. It's kind of a breakdown product from nucleic acids and DNA. And we make this stuff and then we excrete it. But it seems to be high in patients with obesity and metabolic syndrome. And it can cause a disease called gout, where you get this arthritis that affects typically the big toe. And the bad part is that if you're pre-diabetic, it increases your risk to become diabetic. If you have elevated blood pressure, it increases your risk to become hypertensive. If you're overweight, it increases your risk to become obese. So it's one kind of related problem. Some people present more with a fatty liver, others present more with the diabetes, but it's all part of one syndrome. So that means that there could be a central mechanism driving it all. 20 years old, it seemed like for many of us that we were invincible. We could eat anything we want. We could do anything we wanted to do. Didn't matter. We weren't going to gain weight, but something changed. We call it our metabolism has changed. We're now, as we get older, suddenly it's easier to gain weight. But why is that? So the first thing to know is that animals actually regulate their weight really well. If they eat too much one day, they'll eat less the next. They keep their weight stable. If you overfeed them or if you fast them, their weights will change, but then when you stop that, they'll go right back to the weight, and not just their normal weight for that time of the year. It's really interesting. So weight is normally tightly regulated. But there are some animals that will intentionally gain weight. And so they'll maintain their normal weight 9 months a year, and then, a few months before winter, suddenly they start preparing for winter, and they start eating a lot, like the bear, the hibernating ground squirrel. And the weight, the fat, actually provides a caloric source. It's like a type of calorie they can use when there's no food around. Well, it's not just the calories and the energy that's produced. When you burn fat, you also produce water. And for some animals in the world, they're really, water is kind of a critical thing. And so if you like living in the desert, it's good to have a little extra fat on board, because when you burn the fat, you produce water. That's why the camel has a hump on its back. So in the wild, fat is a good thing. Fat can keep you alive. Fat is a mechanism to help you survive when there's no food and no water. But it isn't, when these animals become fat, it isn't just they become fat. They actually develop all those features of metabolic syndrome that we were talking about that we get. They become insulin resistant. They raise their blood pressure. They increase the fat in their liver. They increase the fat in their blood. They do all these different things that we see in people with metabolic syndrome. So yeah, we use fat as a fuel, but in terms of carbohydrates, we use glucose as our primary go-to fuel. And it's used a lot by the brain. It's used in tissues like the muscle. But interestingly, it requires a hormone of insulin to move the glucose from the blood into the muscle. But there's less need for insulin in the brain. The brain, a lot of the brain can use glucose without insulin. So when you become insulin resistant, there's less glucose going to the muscle, so there's more glucose that can go to the brain. Basically, it allows the glucose to build up in the blood so that there's more for the brain. Many animals will use fruit as a mechanism to start increasing their fat. And this is known. The bear, for example, can eat 10,000 grapes in a day in the fall, and it goes from kind of tightly regulating its weight to gaining 8 to 10 pounds a day. You have to know that the main nutrient in fruit is fructose, and that's a sugar. It's sort of like glucose. It's distinct from glucose. It's much sweeter. What we've discovered is that when fructose and glucose are together, then suddenly you have something that people love, and that was the discovery of sugar, table sugar, sucrose, which is a fructose and glucose molecule bound together. And then in the 70s, they discovered that they could make a sweetener from corn called high fructose corn syrup, which is a mixture of fructose and glucose. And then, of course, there's what we call those high carb foods like potatoes and rice, and they have starch, they don't have sugar, so they don't have fructose in them. But what happens is these foods have a lot of starch and they break down to glucose. The question was, could fructose be a nutrient that activates the switch that makes you want to gain fat? So we took mice, lab mice, and we put fructose in the drinking water. And by God, they loved the drinking water. They were drinking a lot. For the first couple of weeks, they held their weight stable because they were still regulating their weight. And then something changed, and they suddenly lost their control of appetite, and they started eating more and more. They exercised less and less. Metabolism dropped. And what happened was they became fat. Let's just see if it's taste. And so we took mice that had lost their taste because of a genetic manipulation. And then we offer them fructose or water. And, if they can't taste, you would think that they wouldn't care. But guess what? A mouse that can't taste can still figure out where the sugar is. And it will take the sugar water just like it will a normal mouse. So the desire for sugar water is independent of taste. And they will still get fat. If you give them sugar water, they still get fat even though they can't taste it. If you block their ability to metabolize fructose, and we can do that by blocking the enzyme, and I call that enzyme KHK, and when you block it, we call it a knockout. So these mice can't metabolize fructose. Well, when you can't metabolize fructose, guess what? They don't care for fructose anymore, and they don't get obese even when you force them to eat the same amount. So there's something about fructose. They crave it even though they can't taste it. And it's something to do with the metabolism of fructose. The animals that got this sugar, which here's sucrose, which is glucose and fructose, they actually gained a little weight even though they're on a diet. So they were able to conserve their energy enough so that they actually gained weight even though they were eating less than they normally eat. The control animals, of course, lost weight. We're seeing huge differences in metabolism in the body. So the animals that got sugar got fatty liver, they got diabetic, they developed hypertensive. Even when calories are the same, there's something special about fructose. It isn't just making you eat more. It is poisoning your system where you're developing diabetes and fatty liver and all those things. And you can do it even when you're on a diet if you're eating a high sugar diet. You eat calories to make energy. And we make energy that is either immediate energy, which is the ATP that makes me want to be able to do everything you want, or we store it as energy, which is what we call as fat. But fructose is unique because what it does is it has a side path where it generates uric acid inside the cell. And I call it a non-caloric pathway because you can activate that pathway when you block the caloric pathway. And yet when you do that, you activate the switch. So the switch turns out to be associated with this non-caloric pathway unique to fructose. And what that does is it generates uric acid. Inside the cell, uric acid goes up in the blood, and it activates the switch. And if you lower uric acid in these animals, and that's all you do, you can actually affect the ability to raise blood pressure, to increase their weight, increase their triglyceride. So there's an association where uric acid being produced inside the cell is triggering this switch. And how does it do it? Well, basically what it does is it helps reset the energy in the cell to a lower energy. So remember, energy is ATP, and then there's a stored energy, which is fat. The way fructose works is it makes the ATP level low because it tends to shunt more of the calories to fat. So when fructose is initially metabolizes, it consumes some of the ATP. And fructose is unique because it consumes it so rapidly that there's a fall of energy in the cell that then activates an enzyme that removes the AMP. AMP is what's used to reconstitute ATP. sweeps away the AMP to make uric acid, and then the uric acid goes and stuns the energy factories where ATP is made, reducing the ATP production by blocking what we call the Krebs cycle and fatty acid oxidation and all these things you don't really want to hear about. And then it blocks the regeneration of ATP in a low energy state by blocking this great enzyme called AMP kinase. And the result is ATP levels fall. Alarm signal makes the animal feel like it doesn't have enough food, the energy's down, but actually it does. It's just stored fat, and the stored fat can't be released into regular fat because it's blocking that. The animal feels that it's in a low energy state, it feels like it's starving, and guess what it wants to do? Eat. It wants to eat, it wants to increase its fat stores. It's perfect. It's a way to increase fat in an animal that already has fat. Suddenly, these sweeteners that have fructose in it are everywhere, and they're being put in processed foods. And today, about 15% of our diet contains sugar. And some people, it's 25% of our diet is sugars and added sugars. 1700, we were only eating 4 pounds of sugar a year. And today, we're eating 140, 150 pounds of sugar a year. And we're sensitive to fructose, so obesity and diabetes rates are soaring, and they parallel the rise in sugar. Uric acid levels are soaring. They're going up with the advent of sugar in foods and beer and other things that can raise uric acid. The uric acid levels continue to increase in our society, and today about 20 million people in the U.S. have uric acid levels of 7 or higher, and that's the level where you start seeing gout. And when you have gout, guess what? You see a lot of obesity, you see a lot of diabetes, you see a lot of kidney disease, you see a lot of metabolic syndrome. Gout is the greatest risk factor for all these diseases. They're all part of one syndrome. And now, if you look at uric acid levels and the frequency of obesity, look, you have a uric acid of 10, you have a huge chance of having obesity or diabetes. And it's true for kidney disease, and it's true for hypertension. And the higher the uric acid, the greater the risk. And even in people who have a high uric acid, who have no other risk factors, no obesity, no diabetes, no elevated triglycerides, those people, if you have a high uric acid, you're at increased risk. And this slide shows that you have an increased risk for obesity and hypertension and kidney disease and diabetes and fatty liver. It even predicts, of course, heart disease, because when it's predicting all these different diseases, it's going to also predict. And gout, in particular, is associated with a higher risk for these diseases. Is fruit a culprit? Well, the vast majority of fructose you're getting is from sugar. It's from added sugars. Fruit makes up just a small amount. And most fruits, when we eat them, we're only eating a small amount, and the fruit has only a limited amount of fructose when we're eating an individual fruit. If you had a bowl of grapes on the couch, you're going to get fat. An individual fruit is not going to do it. It's got fiber, it's got vitamin C, it's got potassium, it's got a lot of things that block the effects of fructose. And so you have to eat a fair amount, especially ripe fruit, and we tend to like tart fruit. And what's more, the intestine removes about the first 4 or 5 grams of fructose. So that really helps out a lot too. So in summary, there is a biologic switch. Obesity is driven by a switch. That switch is fructose. And how the fructose works is it drops the energy in the cell, creating a false sense of starvation. And the major sources of fructose are sugar and high fructose corn syrup. They make up the most. And it's really liquid sugar that's the worst. Humans are more sensitive to fructose because they had a mutation. And we're eating a lot of it. Some people make it 25% of their diet. And this is why we're developing obesity, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and all these diseases.